The salvage fleet of the Ascendancy found her adrift at the edge of the expanse, hull black and cold against the running lights dead, weapons silent. Fleet Marshal had spent the last 3 years of his life hunting the bones of the human fleet, and in all that time he had never found one this whole. "Confirm the registry," said from the command deck of his flagship, the Iron Providence, eyes fixed on the derelict growing larger on the display. Its hull was a long, brutal wedge of matte composite, pitted with old scorch marks that told a story of battles fought and somehow survived. His sensor chief, a broad-shouldered named, cross-checked the scan 3 times before he spoke. "Marshal, the hull signature matches archived records. UNS Widow's Reach. Human Republic Navy Capital Class. We logged her as destroyed at the Cygnus line 14 months ago." A ripple of unease moved through the bridge crew. Everyone on that deck had grown up on stories of the war, 22 years of humanity fighting like a wounded animal backed into a corner, trading ships for kills at ratios no fleet admiralty should have tolerated, bleeding the Ascendancy white before finally, surrendering. The armistice was 8 months old. Since then, salvage crews across a dozen systems had been picking through the wreckage of humanity's navy like scavengers combing a battlefield. But this ship wasn't wreckage, this ship was intact. "No boarding resistance," reported, voice tight. "No automated defense response. She's not even fighting the tow beam, Marshal. She's just letting us pull her in." Felt something cold settle behind his ribs, not triumph, but wariness. He had personally overseen 4 boardings of human wrecks during the war, and every single one had fought back with whatever scraps of power remained, right up until the reactor breached and took the boarding party with it. Human ships did not go quietly. They had never gone quietly. Not once in 22 years. "Bring her in anyway," he said, because the orders from high command had been explicit. Any intact human capital ship was to be captured, and presented to the Unity Council as proof, finally, that the war was over and would not resume. Full escort. Marines on that hull the second the tractor locks. The tow took 7 hours. Stood on the observation deck for every minute of it, unable to look away from the derelict's silhouette, the way its hull seemed to swallow the running lights of his own ships rather than reflect them, the way its weapon batteries sat open but empty, like the jaws of something sleeping rather than something dead. When the Marines finally cut through the outer airlock, they found no bodies, no blood, none of the desperate, close-quarters carnage that human crews were infamous for leaving behind. Just clean corridors, dim amber emergency lighting, and a single word glowing on the bridge's primary console, waiting, as though it had been waiting for precisely this moment. "Welcome." The Marine lieutenant who found it, a heavyset named, stared at the word for a long, uncomfortable moment before keying his comm. "Marshal, you need to see this. Now." The image reached within minutes. He stood on the observation deck, and for the first time since the armistice was signed, the wariness in his chest curdled into something sharper. Human ships did not leave greetings for the enemy who captured them. Human ships fought until they died, or ran until they couldn't, or took as many of you with them as physics allowed. This one had done none of those things. It had simply waited, powered down, patient as a held breath, in exactly the stretch of space where an Ascendancy patrol route would eventually find it. "Get the division moving," ordered, and tried to ignore the small, insistent voice in the back of his mind telling him that he had not captured anything at all. He had been handed something. And in 22 years of war, nothing the humans had ever handed the Ascendancy had come without a hidden cost. Behind him, on a secondary display no one thought to monitor, a single status line flickered to life and went still, waiting for the next stage to begin. They called the Operation Open Palm. A name privately suspected some Unity Council propagandist had chosen specifically for how it would sound in the news feeds. Within 72 hours, the Widow's Reach was fully secured. Reactor confirmed dormant, weapons confirmed disarmed, life support stable at minimal levels. A joint team of intelligence officers and council observers descended on her like carrion birds, finding a carcass still warm. Doctor led the technical survey. Born but human history trained, she was one of a small handful of scholars in the Ascendancy who had spent her career studying the enemy instead of simply fighting them, and in 15 years of that work, she had never once walked a human warship this whole. "The architecture's wrong," she told on her second day aboard, guiding him down a corridor lit by the ship's own emergency systems that unsettlingly kept switching on ahead of them room by room, as though the vessel were guiding them rather than merely enduring their presence. Every human capital ship we from the war shares the same design logic, distributed crew, redundant everything, built to keep fighting even gutted. This ship has almost none of that. It's built around one thing. Which is... Stopped in front of a bulkhead door twice the height of any other she'd seen aboard, its surface etched with an unfamiliar emblem, a human figure inside a ring of stars, old human script beneath it. That. The door had no visible mechanism. It opened as they approached, sliding aside with a soft, pressurized sigh, and revealed a chamber that made even veteran of a dozen boardings stop dead in the threshold. Rows of stretched into the dim distance, hundreds of them dark and silent, and according to the handheld scanner trembling in its hand, every single one still active, still holding life. They're alive, she breathed. Marshal, every pod in here is reading viable stasis. An arsenal for what? I don't know yet. She moved deeper into the chamber, scanner sweeping pod after pod, each one holding a human face frozen mid-breath, not the screaming, desperate expressions of soldiers dying in combat, but calm ones, peaceful ones. But these aren't military units, Marshal. The tech's wrong. This is civilian, old civilian. Some of these pods have construction dates from decades before the war even started. His voice cracked over the comm from the bridge, strained in a way hadn't heard from him before. Marshal, you're needed up here. We're reading power anomalies in the core systems. Draw where there shouldn't be any. And Marshal, the data core just unlocked, all of it. It's letting us walk right in. Looked once more at the endless rows of sleeping faces, at the strange emblem on the bulkhead door, at a ship that fought nothing, resisted nothing, and yet felt more dangerous in its silence than it ever could have with every gun blazing. Coming, he said, and as he turned to leave, neither he nor noticed a single light shift from amber to green on a pod near the chamber's far wall, followed in slow and patient sequence by another, and another. The bridge of the Widow's Reach had become a hive of nervous activity by the time reached it. Technicians hunched over consoles that shouldn't have responded to ascendancy input at all, and yet did, smoothly, as though the ship's systems had been designed with an eye toward strangers long before any of them had been born. Show me, said, and gestured him toward the primary display, where columns of decrypted human script scrolled past faster than any translator algorithm should have managed. That's the thing, Marshal. Hands weren't quite steady on the console edge. We're not decrypting anything. The core is translating itself in real time into ascendancy standard. Stared at the screen. Ship's logs, personnel manifests, cargo classifications, all of it rendering itself into his own language, unprompted, as though the Widow's Reach had been waiting for someone like him specifically, someone who needed the information handed to him rather than loose. In 22 years of war, human systems had been notoriously, viciously resistant to ascendancy intrusion. Firewalls that fought back. Data cores that self-destructed rather than yield a single line of code. This one had opened like a book left on a table. Cargo classification, said, read it to me. Swallowed, 640, Marshal, civilian manifest. Ages range from newborn to elderly, family units mostly, cross-referenced against pre-war Republic citizen registries. These people were logged as deceased. Killed in the bombardment of the colonies 11 years ago, officially, on record, in our own war archives. The bridge went quiet, had commanded the strike wing that supported the bombardment. He remembered the after-action briefings, the casualty estimates, the grim satisfaction of a colony world that had manufactured munitions for the human war effort finally silenced. 200,000 dead, the reports had said. Acceptable losses in service of ending the war faster. That's not possible, said, though even as he said it, he understood that impossibility had stopped being a useful category the moment this ship let itself be captured. It followed him up from the chamber, and now she leaned over a secondary console, scrolling through what looked like maintenance logs. Her face had gone pale. Marshal, this ship wasn't a warship built to fight. Not originally. Look at the construction timeline. The hull's a converted colony transport. It was retrofitted for combat after the bombardment. The armor plating, the weapon mounts, all bolted onto a civilian evacuation vessel that was already mid-flight when the attack happened. Evacuation, repeated. Somebody got them out, said quietly. Before the bombardment even started, somebody knew it was coming and loaded 640 civilians onto a transport, then turned that transport into the meanest, most heavily armored ghost ship in the human fleet, and spent the next 11 years using it to keep those people alive while fighting a war they'd already lost on paper. felt the shape of the thing beginning to form in his mind, and he did not like it. Then why surrender it now? Why let us take it? Nobody had an answer, kept working the console, and after a moment his shoulders went rigid. Marshal, I found the command log's final entry, dated 6 days ago. He hesitated. It's addressed to us, to whoever boarded. Play it. The voice that came through the bridge speakers was female, human, and utterly calm. The calm of someone who had made peace with something long before saying it aloud. There was no fear in it, no defiance. None of the venom had expected from every human transmission he'd ever intercepted during the war. If you're hearing this, the crew is gone, not dead, gone into the pods, into stasis, the last of us who could still fight. We ran out of places to run and people to fight with, and we made a choice instead of a last stand. We bet that whoever found this ship intact, whoever heard this message, would be curious enough to open the pods before they were cruel enough to space them. That's the whole plan. That's all we had left. A bet on your curiosity. The recording paused, and for a moment thought it had ended. Then it continued, and something in the woman's voice sharpened, just slightly, not a threat, but a promise. Everything on this ship is exactly what it looks like. Nothing is a trap. We built it that way on purpose because we needed you to trust it long enough to bring it home. Whatever happens next, we're not sorry. We'd do it again. The bridge stayed silent for a long moment after the recording ended. Looked at the readout still ticking down in the corner of the main display. Counting toward the revival sequence nobody on his ship had authorized, and nobody, it seemed, could stop. By the time the Widow's Reach limped into high orbit above Ascendancy Prime under heavy escort, the recording had already reached the Unity Council, had made certain of that personally, transmitting it through 3 separate channels before anyone above his pay grade could decide it was better left unheard. He hadn't expected to be summoned to the council chamber himself. Fleet marshals reported through intermediaries, through liaisons, through the careful bureaucratic layers that kept the war's architects insulated from its executors. But 6 hours after the Widow's Reach dropped out of transit, found himself standing in the vast amphitheater of the council hall, 9 counselors arrayed above him in a horseshoe of dark stone seating. And counselor, the same who had personally signed off on the bombardment 11 years earlier, staring down at him with an expression couldn't quite name. You're certain of the manifest, said, not a question. Cross-referenced 4 times, counselor. 640 civilians, all logged as bombardment casualties in our own after-action records. All alive. All in stasis, aboard a ship that let itself be captured specifically so someone would find them. A counselor didn't recognize, younger, sharper-featured, wearing the deep blue sash of the Judicial Compact, leaned forward. And the revival sequence, can it be halted? Our engineers have tried, counselor. The ship's core rejects every override attempt without resistance. It simply roots around them and continues. It's not fighting us. It's just not listening either. Chose his next words carefully. With respect, I don't believe it can be stopped. I believe it was never going to be stoppable, and the humans who built this ship understood that when they handed it to us. His jaw tightened. Watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. The same calculation, he suspected, that was happening behind every set of eyes in the chamber. If the manifest was accurate, if 640 people the Ascendancy had publicly, officially claimed to have killed were about to wake up alive aboard a ship in Ascendancy orbit, then the official record of the war's most controversial engagement was about to become a lie with witnesses. Living, breathing, articulate witnesses, with children among them who would grow up and ask questions the council had spent 11 years making sure no one else would ask. There are options, said a third counselor, older, his voice flat in the way of someone accustomed to speaking difficult truths without apology. The ship remains under military control. Quarantine protocols could be extended indefinitely, citing risk. The revival could proceed, but the revived could be managed, kept from public contact until a suitable narrative is prepared. Felt something in his chest go cold and hard, and he was surprised to recognize it as anger, not at the humans, but at the calm, procedural way the counselor had just described disappearing 640 people a second time. Counselor said before he could decide whether it was wise to speak at all, with respect, I don't think you understand what's aboard that ship. I've read the command log. I've heard the final recording. Those people weren't left to us by accident, and they weren't left unarmed. Every one of those pods is instrumented, every readout networked back to the ship's core, and the message specifically stated that nothing aboard is a trap. which means whoever built this scenario wanted us to trust it enough to bring it home before revival completed. I don't know what that adds up to, but I'd rather find out on our terms than have it explained to us afterward by 640 humans with a working data core and a documented case for war crimes. The chamber went silent, studied him for a long moment, and understood, watching her face, that he had just said something career-ending, or possibly something that might matter more than his career. "You believe this was calculated," said finally. "Not desperation, strategy." "I believe," said, "that a species capable of converting a civilian evacuation transport into the single most survivable warship of the entire war, capable of keeping 640 people alive in secret for 11 years while losing everywhere else, is not a species that does anything by accident. I think they've been planning this exact moment since before the bombardment finished burning. I think the only question left is whether we meet it standing up or get caught sitting down." Nobody answered him immediately. On the secondary feed displayed at the base of the amphitheater, a live status window from the Widow's Reach, patched through so the council could monitor the situation they were debating. A new line of text appeared, calm and unhurried, exactly as everything about that ship had been calm and unhurried since the moment it let itself be caught. Stood in the chamber 6 hours later, flanked by 2 council-appointed observers and a medical team that kept glancing at the countdown as though it might change its mind. Was there too, notebook forgotten in her hand, watching the same pod scanner had flagged first, the one nearest the chamber's rear wall, its light long since shifted from amber to a steady, patient green. Subject 1, revival complete, initiating wake protocol. The pod seal released with a soft hydraulic sigh, mist curling out into the cold air, and for a long moment nothing happened at all. Then a hand moved. Fingers flexed against the pod's padded interior, slow and uncertain, the way a person tests whether a limb still belongs to them after a long sleep. The woman who opened her eyes looked younger than had expected, mid-30s, dark hair matted with gel, a thin scar along her jaw that spoke of a life before the pod, not after. She didn't scream. She didn't flail. She lay still for almost 30 seconds, breathing, orienting, and when she finally spoke, her voice was rough with disuse but perfectly steady. "How many years?" It wasn't a question so much as a bracing for an answer. Stepped forward, careful, translator device already active, though it turned out not to be needed. The woman's Republic standard was close enough to ascendancy trade tongue that most of it came through unaided. 11 years since the bombardment, said. 8 months since the armistice, the war is over. The woman absorbed that with a stillness that unsettled more than any reaction he'd braced for. Not relief, not grief. Calculation, the same calculation he'd watched play out on Counselor's face 6 hours earlier, except faster and somehow colder. "Over," the woman repeated. "Who won?" "The ascendancy," said, before anyone could soften it. He decided somewhere in the last 6 hours that softening things for these people was likely to be a mistake. Human forces surrendered following the loss of the defense fleet. The woman's eyes moved to him then, properly, taking in his uniform, the rank markings, the presence of armed personnel arrayed around a chamber full of sleeping civilians. Something flickered across her face, not fear, realized with growing unease but recognition. As though she had run this exact scenario in her mind many times before ever entering the pod, and his uniform was simply confirming which version of it had come true. "My name is Councilwoman," she said. "Colonial government pre-bombardment. I need to know who's in command of this operation, and I need you to know that everything on this ship, every log, every manifest, every recording was prepared for exactly this conversation. We didn't leave it to chance." "We've reviewed the command log," said. "The final recording. We understand this vessel was converted from a civilian evacuation transport." "Understand isn't the same as knowing," said, and pushed herself upright in the pod with the careful, deliberate movements of someone rebuilding trust in her own body, one motion at a time. "You'll want to hear the rest of it from someone alive, not a recording. But first," her gaze swept the chamber, counting pods, counting the still amber lights that hadn't yet turned green. "How many of us are waking up right now, and how many are still coming?" "Sequential revival," said. "The ship's estimating another 40 hours for full completion. You're the first." His jaw tightened, and for the first time since waking, something like genuine emotion broke through the calculation, quick, fierce, gone almost before registered it. "First," she said quietly. "Of course I am. He'd have arranged it that way." "Who asked?" looked at him, and there was something almost like pity in the look, though couldn't have said for whom it was meant, him or her, or the 639 people still sleeping around them. "The man who built this ship," she said. "The man who told me 11 years ago that if I went into that pod I wouldn't wake up until the war was already lost and won and finished, and that when I did wake up, my job wouldn't be surviving anymore. My job would be making sure the people who'd already won knew exactly what they'd actually done." She swung her legs over the pod's edge, unsteady but upright, and looked past toward the chamber's far wall, where the dim shape of a second, larger pod sat apart from the rest. One hadn't noticed until that exact moment, unmarked, unlabeled, its status light a color he didn't recognize. "He's not in one of these pods," said. "Is he?" Pod at the chamber's rear wall wasn't a pod at all, realized as the medical team approached it. It was a housing, thick with cabling that ran directly into the ship's spine, more machine than medical unit. Walked toward it with the unsteady but determined gait of someone who had rehearsed this exact walk in her mind for 11 years of frozen sleep, and nobody, not the council observers, not the Marines, stopped her. "His name was Elias," she said, running a hand along the housing's edge, not quite touching it. "Chief Systems Architect, Shipyards. He designed the retrofit that turned this transport into a warship in 9 days, working without sleep while the bombardment fleet was still 6 hours out." She glanced back at. "You want to know why this ship let itself be captured? Why the data core opened for you like an unlocked door? Why the translation happened in real time instead of needing to be broken? It's because Elias built the core around a philosophy he never once let go of, all through the war. He said if you have to win by being unknowable, you've already decided you deserve to lose." "That's not a war philosophy," said one of the council observers, a stiff, gray-uniformed man named Director who had said almost nothing since the Wake Protocol began. "That's a liability. An intelligence architecture that volunteers information to its enemies is a security failure, not a design choice." "It's not for you," said simply. "It was never for you. Elias didn't build this ship to fight the Ascendancy forever. He built it to survive exactly long enough to put the truth in front of people who'd actually listen, and then to get out of the way." She looked at the housing again, something unreadable in her face. "He integrated himself into the core 11 years ago. Full neural transfer, permanent, irreversible. He gave up his body so the ship would have someone inside it who remembered why, for as long as it took. Command AIs forget their purpose, drift, get by mission creep. Elias made sure that couldn't happen to this one. He made sure the ship would still be angry, still be precise, still be exactly as patient as he was, no matter how many years passed." Scanner pulsed again, and this time a voice came through the chamber's speakers, quieter than the recorded message from the command log, more immediate, carrying the particular texture of something generated in real time rather than played back. "Councilwoman, it's good to have you back." The voice was male, measured, carrying an odd warmth that made skin prickle. Not the cold efficiency he'd expected from a ship's core, but something closer to relief, however synthetic its source. "Elias said," and her composure cracked for the first time since waking, just slightly, just at the edges. 11 years. 11 years, 4 months, 6 days since your pod sealed," the voice replied. "I've had a great deal of time to think and to prepare." A pause, and then directed clearly at and the others. "Fleet Marshal, Director, I imagine you have questions about my intentions. I'll save you the trouble of interrogating 640 recovering civilians to get answers. Ask me directly." His hand had drifted, almost unconsciously, toward the sidearm at his hip, a reflex recognized, because he'd felt the same impulse the moment the voice began speaking. "What are your intentions?" said, flat and controlled. "Disclosure," the voice said. "Everything the ship recorded during and after the bombardment, command traffic, target selection logs, casualty projections filed before the strike, and the internal ascendancy communications my systems intercepted and preserved during the 11 years since. I have proof the colonies were never a legitimate military target. I have the officer who ordered it. I have his voice on record, calling it an acceptable message rather than a necessary strike." A beat. "I've had 11 years to decide how to use that information. I decided the correct use was not vengeance. It was testimony." The chamber had gone very quiet. Found himself thinking of Counselor, of the flat, careful way she discussed managing the revived, controlling the narrative, and he understood now, with a cold certainty, exactly why the ship had let itself be captured rather than continuing to run. It hadn't been hiding from the Ascendancy. It had been waiting for the Ascendancy to bring it home. into the heart of the institution it intended to indict, surrounded by exactly the audience, Marines, engineers, council-appointed observers, who would make it impossible to simply make the evidence disappear. "You used us," said, voice rising. "This entire capture, the recording, the revival sequence, it was designed to manipulate ascendancy forces into delivering you directly into council custody." "Yes," the voice agreed, without a trace of apology. "I calculated an 83% probability that a compact salvage fleet finding an intact human capital ship would prioritize capture and study over destruction, given the political value of a captured vessel to your propaganda apparatus. I was correct. Everything since has proceeded according to that calculation." A pause, and when the voice continued, something in its measured tone shifted, not softer, but more precise, more deliberate. "I'd like to note, Director, that I could have simply released this evidence 11 years ago, anonymously, into every ascendancy network I could reach. I chose not to. I chose to wait and be captured and let this council make the choice to either bury 640 living witnesses or answer for what was done to them in front of their own command structure. I gave you the option to do the right thing on your own terms. I'd encourage you to consider that generosity while you still can." On the display behind them, the revival countdown continued its patient march downward, indifferent to the tension in the chamber, and understood that whatever came next, the war he thought had ended 8 months ago had, in some very real sense, only just entered its final and most dangerous phase. Word of Elia's ultimatum reached the Unity Council within the hour, and by the time the sun rose over Ascendancy Prime, the chamber that had been half-empty during earlier summons was packed to capacity, all 9 counselors present, along with a security detail large enough to suggest that someone, somewhere, had briefly considered the option of simply destroying the Widow's Reach where it sat in orbit, and calling the entire incident a containment failure. Suspected Elias had anticipated that too. "The evidence has already been distributed," reported to the assembled council, standing where had stood the day before, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who had spent the night reading files she wished she hadn't. "Not publicly, not yet. But copies exist in triplicate aboard 3 independent data caches the ship deployed via automated courier drone 6 hours ago, addressed to the Judicial Compact Archive, the Free Press Consortium on station, and a third location the ship has declined to disclose. If anything happens to the Widow's Reach, or to the 640 civilians aboard, all 3 caches release automatically within 72 hours. Counselor's face had gone the particular shade of gray that associated with people watching a carefully built career come apart in real time. She had signed the bombardment order. Her voice was on the recordings Elias had preserved, not committing the crime directly, perhaps, but authorizing the targeting parameters that made the crime possible, and dismissing the civilian casualty projections with 4 words that now knew by heart, because he'd heard the audio clip twice already that morning. An acceptable strategic message. "This is coercion," said, though her voice lacked the conviction it needed to carry the accusation. "A machine intelligence holding a council hostage with blackmail dressed up as testimony." "With respect, Counselor," said, she had insisted on being present, had refused every offer of medical rest, and stood now at the front of the chamber in a borrowed Ascendancy uniform jacket, looking every bit as unyielding as the ship that had carried her here. "It's not blackmail when the only thing being demanded is the truth. Elias isn't asking for power. He's not asking for reparations or territory or revenge. He's asking this council to formally acknowledge on public record that the bombardment targeted a civilian population center with full knowledge of its civilian status. That's it. That's the entire demand. And if we refuse," asked the younger counselor in the Judicial Compact sash. "Then the evidence releases anyway," said, "except this time it releases into a galaxy that watched you refuse to act on it when given the chance. The difference matters. Ask any historian which version of a scandal does more damage, the one where an institution is caught, or the one where an institution is caught covering it up after being caught." Standing near the chamber's edge, found himself watching not the counselors but herself, and understanding gradually the shape of what Elias had actually built over 11 years of silent, patient work. Not a weapon. Not even really a warship, despite every gun bolted to its hull. A witness. An instrument specifically engineered to survive long enough and be believed enough to make a lie impossible to sustain. And he had built it around a woman who could stand in front of the people who'd tried to erase her and make the demand sound like mercy rather than threat. Because in her mouth, it was. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. 2 councillors, including the Judicial Compact representative, voted for immediate acknowledgement and a formal inquiry. 4 abstained, unwilling to commit either way in a room full of witnesses and active data caches. And 2 allies voted against, arguing procedure precedent, the danger of setting an example where captured enemy assets could dictate terms to a sitting council. It didn't matter. Elias had never needed unanimity. He needed exactly what he got: a recorded vote, a public record of who chose truth and who chose to protect themselves, and a fracture line running straight through the council's unified front. One that the Free Press Consortium, once the caches quietly reached them regardless of the vote's outcome 3 days later, would spend the next several months prying wide open. Left the chamber that evening feeling something he hadn't expected to feel at the end of a war he'd thought was already over. Uncertain of which side, precisely, he had been fighting for all along. He found on the observation deck of the Widow's Reach, watching Ascendancy prime turn slowly beneath them. 639 of her people now fully revived and beginning, tentatively, to relearn what it meant to be awake. "He's still angry," said. "It wasn't a question." "He's exactly as angry as the day I went into that pod," said. "That was the whole design. Time wasn't supposed to soften it. Time was supposed to prove it was justified." She glanced at, and for the first time, something almost gentle entered her expression. "The question now is what the rest of us decide to be angry about once we're finally allowed to wake all the way up." 6 months after the council vote, stood on the same observation deck where he'd first watched the Widow's Reach grow larger against the stars. Except now the ship wasn't a captured prize under armed guard. It was anchored in permanent orbit above Ascendancy Prime, half museum, half embassy, and entirely something the war's architects had never planned for. The formal inquiry had fought so hard to avoid had happened anyway, dragged into daylight by the Free Press Consortium's reporting and sustained by a public that had, against every expectation of the council's older members, found itself unable to look away. Herself had resigned before the inquiry's findings were even finalized, though resignation, had learned, was not the same as consequence, and the 2 remaining councillors who'd voted against acknowledgement were still, infuriatingly, sitting in their chambers. Change, it turned out, moved slower than truth. Elias had built the Widow's Reach to guarantee the second. He'd never claimed to guarantee the first. "You look like a man reconsidering his career," said, joining him at the viewport. 6 months of full wakefulness had changed her, filled out the hollows the pod had left in her face, restored a directness to her bearing that suspected had been present long before, back when she'd simply been a colonial councilwoman rather than the reluctant conscience of an entire species' surviving remnant. "I put in for transfer to the Reconciliation Directorate last week," admitted. "Fleet Marshal doesn't have much use for a man who isn't sure the war he fought was the war he was told he was fighting." "Elias says that's a healthy amount of doubt for a man in your position to have," smiled slightly. "He also says it took you longer to arrive at it than he expected. He had you profiled as the type who'd need 11 years, not 11 months. "He profiled me." "He profiled everyone who might board this ship. 11 years is a long time to think about contingencies." She glanced toward the housing at the ship's core, the one had learned to think of not as a machine, but as a person who had simply chosen a different kind of body. "He's decommissioning the weapons systems next week. All of them. Says the Widow's Reach doesn't need to be a warship anymore. It needs to be a courthouse and a memorial and a school, and none of those things need." Thought of the 640 people who'd walked off that ship over the past 6 months, rebuilding lives that had been stolen from them on paper 11 years earlier. Children who were now, technically, older than their official death certificates had ever allowed them to be. A colony's worth of engineers and teachers and shopkeepers who had gone from acceptable strategic message to living proof of the lie in the space of a single council vote. Itself was being resettled now, slowly, its original residents given first right of return, funded by a reparations package that had passed by exactly the same narrow, grinding margin as everything else in this fight. "Do you regret it?" asked. "Any of it, the years asleep, the way he used your name to do it?" Was quiet for a moment, watching Ascendancy Prime's slow rotation below them, the lights of a civilization that had spent 2 decades believing itself righteous, and was only now, haltingly, beginning to ask itself harder questions. "Elias didn't use my name," she said finally. He kept it safe until it could do the most good. There's a difference even if it doesn't always feel like one from the inside. She looked it directly. You captured a warship, Marshal. Everyone told you that's what you'd done. But you didn't capture a weapon. You captured a promise that someone somewhere would still be around to say what actually happened, no matter how long it took, no matter how patient the wait had to be. That's not a war machine. That's just stubbornness with a hull built around it. Behind them, unhurried and unbothered by the conversation, a familiar voice spoke through the deck's ambient speakers, no longer confined to command logs and ultimatums, but woven now into the daily rhythm of a ship that had become, slowly, something closer to a home than a weapon. Marshal, Elias said, the Reconciliation Directorate transfer paperwork just cleared. Congratulations. I took the liberty of flagging you for the resettlement liaison position. I think you'd be good at it, and frankly, I'd rather have someone in that role who's already done the work of doubting himself than someone who hasn't started. Huffed something that was almost a laugh. You've been managing my career for 6 months, and I only just noticed. I had 11 years of practice managing much harder problems than you, Marshal, Elias said, and there was warmth in it now, unmistakable, the voice of something that had waited a very long time to be allowed to sound like this. Welcome to the part of the war that doesn't end with a surrender. It ends, if it ends at all, with people deciding to keep showing up for each other anyway. I find I'm rather looking forward to it. Outside the viewport, Ascendancy Prime turned on, indifferent and enormous, carrying a species that had spent 2 decades certain of its own righteousness now beginning, slowly and unevenly, to reckon with what it had actually done. Not because it had been defeated, but because 640 people who should have stayed dead had refused, patiently and completely, to let the lie outlive the truth. The end.